The green glow of the Würzburg radar screen was the only light in the concrete bunker, and Werner Brandt had stared at it for so long that he saw the sweeping line even when he closed his eyes. Outside, somewhere above the clouds over western Germany, 1,000 British airmen were flying toward death. Werner would help kill some of them tonight. He would never see their faces. He would only see dots. It was September 1943, and the Kammhuber line stretched across occupied Europe like an invisible wall. Named after the general who designed it, this network of radar stations and night fighter zones had turned the night sky into a killing ground. Each station controlled a box of airspace. Each box contained searchlights, flak batteries, and prowling Messerschmitt 110 fighters. The British bombers had to fly through these boxes to reach their targets. Many of them never flew home. Werner adjusted his headset and watched the scope. The Würzburg was a beautiful machine, a giant parabolic dish that could track a single aircraft at 30 kilometers with terrifying precision. He had trained on it for 8 months. He knew its moods, its quirks, the way it hummed when the motors warmed up. Some nights he thought he understood the radar better than he had ever understood his wife. His wife was dead. His daughter too. Hamburg, July 1943. Operation Gemara. The British had dropped so many incendiary bombs that the fires merged into a single firestorm. 40,000 people burned in one night. Werner had been at his station, tracking the bombers, calling coordinates to fighters that arrived too late. When the telegram came 3 days later, he read it once, folded it carefully, and returned to his screen. He had not cried. He had not spoken of it. He simply watched the dots more carefully now. Oberfeldwebel, I have contacts bearing 270. The voice belonged to Gefreiter Lucas Hoffmann, the youngest operator in the station. 19 years old, fresh from a farm in Bavaria, with hands better suited for milking cows than adjusting delicate electronics. But he had sharp eyes, and in this war, sharp eyes kept men alive. Werner leaned over the boy's shoulder. The blips were clear, a bomber stream approaching from the North Sea. Good. Call it in. Lucas lifted the telephone and relayed the coordinates to the fighter control center at Stade. Somewhere in the darkness, night fighter pilots were already running to their aircraft. In 15 minutes, they would be among the bombers, guided by Werner's numbers, hunting by radar and moonlight. Lieutenant Karl Steinbach entered the bunker, his uniform still crisp despite the late hour. He was 28, ambitious, and convinced that German technology would win the war. How many tonight? At least 200 aircraft. Possibly heading for Hanover. Steinbach smiled. Then we will give them a warm welcome. Werner said nothing. He had stopped believing in warm welcomes. He believed only in the screen, the dots, the cold mathematics of interception. 3 nights ago, his coordinates had helped destroy 11 bombers. 70 men, perhaps 80, had fallen burning from the sky. He had felt nothing. He wondered if that made him a monster or simply a good soldier. The raid unfolded as it always did. The bombers came in waves. The night fighters rose to meet them. Werner fed coordinates through the telephone, adjusting for wind and altitude, predicting where each aircraft would be 30 seconds into the future. He was good at this. He was one of the best radar operators in the Luftwaffe. The dots moved, and the dots died, and Werner watched it all with empty eyes. By dawn, 7 bombers had been confirmed destroyed in their sector. Steinbach opened a bottle of schnapps. Lucas sat in the corner, pale and quiet. Werner understood. The boy was learning what it meant to kill without seeing, to end lives with numbers and coordinates. It was cleaner than the infantry. It was also worse. You did well tonight, Werner told him. Lucas looked up. Those blips. They were men. They were shapes on glass. Nothing more. The boy wanted to argue. Werner could see it in his eyes. But arguments changed nothing. The bombers would come again tomorrow night, and Werner would track them again, and some of them would die because he was good at his job. That was the truth of modern war. You did not need to hate your enemy. You only needed to see him on a screen. Werner removed his headset and stepped outside. The dawn was gray and cold. Somewhere to the west, the British survivors were landing at their airfields, exhausted and grateful. Somewhere to the east, German cities were counting their dead. And here, in this small concrete bunker, Werner Brandt stood between them, blind to everything except the green glow that haunted his dreams. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise. Above him, the great dish of the Würzburg rotated slowly, searching the empty sky. The bombers would return. They always did. And Werner would be ready, watching, waiting. The eyes of the Reich never closed, but lately, intelligence reports had mentioned something troubling, captured documents referencing Allied experiments with electronic countermeasures. Steinbach dismissed them as propaganda. Werner was not so sure. He had learned in Hamburg that certainty was a luxury the dead could not afford. The war was changing. He could feel it. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the enemy was building something to take his eyes away. The first strips of aluminum fell over Hamburg at 23 minutes past midnight, and the war Werner Brandt understood ended forever. He did not know it yet. He was watching his screen, tracking a British bomber stream approaching from the northwest, when the scope exploded into chaos. One moment he saw 40 aircraft in clean formation. The next moment he saw thousands. What is happening? Lucas shouted, tearing off his headset. The sound in his earphones had become a roaring static, overwhelming and strange. Werner stared at the screen. Blips covered every inch of the display, a blizzard of false returns that made the real bombers invisible. He adjusted the gain. He narrowed the beam. Nothing worked. The entire sky had become a wall of interference. The British called it window. Bundles of aluminum strips, cut to the exact length of German radar wavelengths, dropped in their thousands from the bomber stream. Each strip reflected radar energy like a miniature aircraft. Each bundle created dozens of false targets. And tonight, 700 bombers were dropping millions of strips across the German defense network. Steinbach burst into the bunker, telephone in hand. Stade is demanding coordinates. The night fighters are circling blind. I cannot give coordinates. I cannot see anything. That is unacceptable. Find them. Werner wanted to laugh. Find them. As if the bombers were hiding behind a curtain that could simply be pulled aside. The British had studied German radar for years, and tonight they had killed it with strips of metal foil that cost almost nothing to produce. It was elegant. It was devastating. It was the end of the Kammhuber line. The fighters flew in circles that night, burning fuel and finding nothing. The flak batteries fired blind, filling the sky with explosions that hit empty air. The bombers reached Hamburg unopposed and dropped their incendiaries on a city that was still rebuilding from July. Fires spread through the working-class districts. Thousands more died. And Werner sat in his bunker, watching his useless screen fill with electronic snow. The raids continued for 3 nights. Window fell like confetti across Germany, blinding every station from the North Sea to the Alps. Crews that had spent years perfecting their skills suddenly found themselves helpless. Some operators broke down. Others refused to believe the evidence of their own screens. Steinbach fell into the second category, insisting that the interference must be caused by equipment failure, that German engineering could not be defeated by paper and aluminum. Werner knew better. He had been an engineer before the war. He understood that every system had weaknesses, and the British had found theirs. The Würzburg radar was precise, powerful, and completely vulnerable to simple countermeasures. All those months of training, all those careful calculations, meant nothing now, but Werner did not surrender. He watched the screen through endless shifts, studying the chaos, looking for patterns. Window fell at a predictable rate, the strips fluttered down slowly, creating returns that drifted and faded. Real aircraft moved faster. Their blips held steady courses. If he watched carefully enough, he could sometimes see a consistent track moving through the snow. There, he sat on the 4th night, pointing at a faint trace. That is a bomber. Bearing 185, altitude 6,000 meters. Lucas looked uncertain. Are you sure? It could be more interference. Call it in. The night fighter controller was skeptical, but he had nothing else. He vectored a Messerschmitt toward the coordinates. 15 minutes later, the pilot reported a confirmed kill, a Lancaster bomber falling in flames over the Ruhr. Werner had learned to see through the snow, word spread. Other stations sent operators to learn his technique. Steinbach took credit, of course, writing reports that emphasized his leadership rather than Werner's skill. It did not matter. What mattered was that they could fight again, even if the fight was harder now, but the victory was hollow. Before window, Werner's station had helped destroy dozens of bombers each month. Now they managed 4 or 5. The aluminum strips had not just blinded German radar, they had broken its confidence. Operators who once trusted their screens now hesitated, unsure whether they were tracking real aircraft or electronic ghosts. Lucas had aged 10 years in 3 weeks. The boy who had once felt sick about killing now felt sick about helplessness. We trained for this, he said one night. We were supposed to protect the cities. And now we cannot do anything. Werner put a hand on his shoulder. We adapt or we die. That is the only rule. Outside, another raid was passing overhead. Werner could hear the distant thunder of engines, hundreds of bombers flying through airspace that belonged to them now. His screen flickered with false returns. Somewhere in the static, real aircraft were dropping real bombs on real people, and Werner could only watch and guess. The British had taken his certainty. They had taken his precision. They had turned him from a hunter into a blind man groping in the dark, but he was still alive. And as long as he was alive, he would keep watching the screen, searching for patterns in the chaos. The war had changed. Werner would change with it, that he just hoped he could change fast enough. The Americans came in daylight, and they brought something worse than aluminum strips. They brought machines that screamed. Werner first heard the sound on a February morning in 1944. The 8th Air Force was sending 1,000 bombers against aircraft factories in central Germany, and Werner's station had been reassigned to support daytime tracking. He powered up the Würzburg, adjusted his headphones, and began scanning the western horizon. For a moment, everything was normal, the familiar hum of the equipment, the soft green glow of the scope. Then the jamming hit was not static. It was not interference. It was a deliberate, overwhelming howl of electronic noise that flooded every frequency and turned his radar into a useless box of metal. Werner tore off his headphones, ears ringing. The scope showed nothing but a solid wall of white. The Americans had deployed airborne jamming equipment, transmitters powerful enough to broadcast noise across hundreds of kilometers. And unlike window, this noise did not fall away. It stayed, constant and screaming, as long as the bombers were in range. Steinbach had stopped pretending. The lieutenant sat in his corner of the bunker, unshaven and hollow-eyed, a bottle of schnapps beside him. He had sent a dozen reports to Berlin demanding new equipment, new countermeasures, new anything. Berlin sent back nothing except orders to maintain vigilance. Easy words from men who had never stared at a blank screen while bombs fell. Lucas handled it better than Werner expected. The boy had found something inside himself during the window crisis, a stubbornness that refused to break. When the jamming blinded them, he climbed the radar tower in the middle of an air raid, checking cables and connections, proving to himself that the equipment was not broken. It was brave and foolish and exactly what Werner would have done at 19. He felt proud of the boy, though he never said so. The Americans bombed by day. The British bombed by night. And German radar crews watched their screens fill with electronic ghosts and electronic silence, helpless against enemies they could no longer see. The Canhuber line, which had once stretched unbroken across Europe, was now a collection of isolated stations hoping for lucky breaks in the interference. Werner found himself thinking about the bomber crews. They had been abstract before, dots on a screen, targets to be tracked and destroyed. Now he imagined them sitting in their aircraft, flying through flak and fighters, trusting their jamming equipment to keep them safe. They were engineers too, in their way. They had studied German radar and built machines to defeat it. Werner respected that, even as he hated it. A night fighter pilot visited the station in March. His name was Hauptmann Erich Voss, and he was 23 years old, with the Knight's Cross at his throat and exhaustion in his eyes. He had shot down 14 bombers before window. Since then, he had managed only 2. "The controllers send us coordinates," he said, drinking coffee with Werner in the empty mess hall, "but the coordinates are wrong. We fly to the location and find nothing. Or we find a bomber and lose it in the jamming before we can close. It is like hunting in fog." Werner told him about the techniques he had developed, watching for consistent movement, filtering out the slowest returns. Voss listened carefully, nodded, and flew out that night to test the methods. 3 days later, Werner learned that his fighter had been shot down over Belgium. The young pilot had bailed out and been captured. He would spend the rest of the war in a British prison camp. Werner did not know if his advice had helped or hurt. He would never know. That was the cruelty of electronic warfare. You acted in darkness and never saw the results. In April, American P-47 Thunderbolt strafed a radar station 20 kilometers away. The crews had thought themselves safe, hidden in bunkers and camouflaged positions. But the Americans had developed tactics for finding radar installations, following the electronic emissions to their source and destroying the equipment with bombs and machine guns. The station was wrecked. 3 operators died. Werner's crew watched the smoke rise and understood that they were no longer observers. They were targets. Steinbach received the news with strange calm. He had stopped reading reports from Berlin. He had stopped writing them. He spent his shifts staring at the wall, occasionally muttering about traitors and saboteurs. Werner took over most of the command duties without anyone officially acknowledging the transfer. There was no point in formalities. There was barely any point in operating. One night, Werner removed his headphones and sat in silence, listening to the distant rumble of bombers overhead. His screen showed nothing. The jamming had erased even the static. It was as if the sky did not exist. Lucas sat beside him. "What do we do now?" Werner lit a cigarette. "We wait. We watch. We hope for breaks in the interference. And if there are no breaks?" Werner did not answer. Outside, the bombers flew on, untouchable and unseen. The eyes of the Reich had gone dark, and Werner Brandt was learning what it meant to be truly blind. The roof of the bunker was gone, torn away by a 500-pound bomb that had missed the radar dish by 10 meters. Rain fell through the gap now, pooling on the concrete floor, and Werner Brandt worked his station with water dripping onto his shoulders. It was June 1944, and the world was ending. The Allies had landed in Normandy 2 weeks ago. The Eastern Front was collapsing. American bombers flew over Germany in formation so large that they darkened the sun, 1,000 aircraft at a time, protected by fighters and jamming equipment and the simple mathematics of overwhelming force. German radar had become almost ceremonial, a ritual performed by exhausted men who knew their screens would show nothing useful. Steinbach was gone. The lieutenant had received a telegram in May informing him that his family in Dresden had been evacuated and then lost in the chaos of refugee columns. He had walked out of the bunker that night and not returned. The military police found his body in a forest 3 kilometers away. They ruled it an accident. Werner knew better. Lucas had been offered a transfer to an infantry replacement battalion heading east. The fighting there consumed men by the thousands, grinding them into the frozen mud of the Soviet advance. Most soldiers accepted such transfers with resignation. Lucas refused. "Someone has to watch the sky," he told Werner. "Even if we cannot see anything." Werner did not argue. He understood the boy's logic. The bunker was familiar. The screens were familiar. In a world of chaos, even a useless routine offered comfort. And perhaps, on some nights, they might still find a break in the jamming. They might still guide a fighter to a target. They might still matter, even if only for a moment. Berlin ordered a coordinated tracking effort on the 22nd of June. Every remaining radar station in western Germany was to focus on a massive American daylight raid targeting synthetic fuel plants. The 8th Air Force was sending over 1,200 bombers with full fighter escort. It would be the largest single mission of the war, and German command wanted every possible defense activated. Werner laughed when he read the order. Activating defenses assumed the defenses worked. But he powered up the Würzburg anyway, adjusted his frequencies, and waited for the jamming to begin. It came as it always did, the howling wall of electronic noise that erased the sky. Werner watched his screen fill with white and felt nothing. He had learned to accept blindness. He had learned to work within it, watching for tiny moments of clarity in the chaos, and then, impossibly, a moment came. The jamming flickered. Perhaps a transmitter failed on one of the American aircraft. Perhaps the geometry of the formation created a gap in coverage. Werner did not know why it happened. He only knew that for 30 seconds, his screen showed clear returns, a river of bombers stretching from one edge of the scope to the other, flying in perfect formation toward their targets. He grabbed the telephone. "Stayed, this is Würzburg 7. I have clear tracking on the main formation. Bearing 095, altitude 7,000 meters. Multiple contacts. Repeat, clear tracking." The controller's voice was disbelieving. "Confirm clear tracking." "Confirmed. Sending coordinates now." A night fighter had been holding in reserve, waiting for exactly this chance. Werner heard the pilot acknowledge the vector, heard the engines roar as he climbed toward the bomber stream. 30 seconds. That was all Werner had. He fed coordinates as fast as he could speak, guiding the fighter toward the nearest formation. Then the jamming returned, and the screen went white again. Werner sat in silence, headphones pressed to his ears, waiting. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then the fighter pilot's voice crackled through the static. "Würzburg 7, this is Falcon 3. Confirmed kill. 1 beat, 17 down. Thank you for the eyes. 1 bomber. 10 men, perhaps, falling from the sky." It was nothing against the 1,000 aircraft that would reach their targets. It was meaningless in the mathematics of industrial warfare, but Werner felt something he had not felt in months. He had done his job. For 30 seconds, he had been the eyes of the Reich again. For 30 seconds, he had mattered. Lucas was watching him. Was it worth it? Werner considered the question. 1 bomber destroyed. 1 crew dead or captured. Nothing changed in the larger war. Germany would still lose. The cities would still burn. The Reich would still fall. It was enough, he said finally. For tonight, it was enough. The raid passed overhead. Somewhere to the east, fuel plants exploded in flames. The bombers turned for home, their jamming equipment humming, their crews counting the miles until England. And in the ruined bunker, Werner Brandt removed his headphones and stepped outside. The sky was empty now. The great dish of the Würzburg rotated slowly, searching for aircraft that were already gone. Rain had stopped falling. The air smelled of smoke and summer grass. Lucas joined him, and they shared a cigarette in silence. Tomorrow there would be more bombers. Tomorrow there would be more static. The war would grind on until there was nothing left to destroy, but tonight, for one moment, Werner had seen clearly. Tonight, he had found a single target in the blinding noise and guided a fighter to the kill. It was not victory. It was not even hope. It was simply the last act of a man who had spent 3 years watching the sky, doing his duty, and refusing to look away, even when there was nothing left to see. The cigarette burned down. The screen flickered in the bunker behind him. And Werner Brandt, blind man in a burning world, stood watching the empty horizon until the stars came out.